there was not one moment when I had a flash and the feeling I have to write this book. It was more a decision that grew over quite a long time, actually, because I got fascinated by the time that historians call early modernity. So that period of time between the end of the Middle Ages and the onset of Enlightenment. And it's a very, very confusing time, full of violence, full of anger, full of religious hate and confusion. It's a dark time, in many ways darker than the Middle Ages. So some of the things that we usually attribute to the Middle Ages, like for example the witch hunts, actually didn't really happen in the Middle Ages, but in early modernity. As a result of the confusion of people in many ways. There was in many ways brought about by the printing press and by the flood of propaganda that was everywhere in Europe. And so I was fascinated by that period, and I thought I want to put a book, not write a book about. Martin Amis once said the word "about" should be outlawed when you talk about novels. So it's about, not a book about this time, but a book set in this time. And then I thought, then why not go to the dark core of it all, to the 30 Years' War, to the moment of absolute, complete collapse of political and civil life. And then I was thinking about how to write a novel about the 30 Years' War. And then I came up with the idea that I needed some character as a guide for the reader, someone who could follow to different places, socially and different places in space. And then I thought, that should be a jester, someone who can perform in little villages, but would also perform in front of noble people and kings and queens. So someone who could really go everywhere in a very static society, in a world where people usually didn't travel, not up or downward in society and not in space. Most people, more than 90% of all people in early modernity died exactly in the place where they were born. So, and then that was the last big decision. I thought, why not then cast not just some fictional jester, why not cast the archaic, mythical, Northern European, German prankster, jester and trickster figure, Tyll Ulenspiegel. And that was kind of, I thought this is the book I want to write. I had said repeatedly that I'm not going to write another historical novel. So I was a bit worried, would people really remind me of that promise? But then I thought, nothing's going to happen. They're not going to put you in prison for breaking that promise. And they didn't.
How was it being a human being at the time in early modernity?
I think it was different in so many ways that it makes you really doubt whether there is some kind of unchanging human substance or human core. Because we like to have this idea that the core of what it means to be human didn't change. At least it didn't change since the ancient Greeks, and people are basically the same everywhere, and they have been the same always. And I think that's not quite true. I think what it means to be human is very fluid, and it really changes over time. It changes over, who I am and who you are changes over our individual lifetime a lot, like to a very, very deep extent. And of course then also over human history it changes a lot, how it feels and what it's like to be human. So life was different in so many aspects. So just to mention a few, most children died a short time after they were born. So about 1 out of 5 children survived childhood. So that doesn't just mean that it's a dangerous time to live in, it also means that the relationship between parents and children must have been completely different. You cannot let yourself love a child that much. You cannot put that much care and love and attention into a single child if chances are very, very high that this child will die. So in a way, everyone grew up without what we think of what the love of parents should look like. And that of course changes everything in life, as we know. We know how important the presence of caregivers and the relationship to them is when you're small. And that was completely different. Other things that were completely different is, and I'm not talking about the philosophical difference, the fact that everyone believed in witchcraft and curses, and of course ghosts and things like that. I'm not even talking about those more abstract things. I'm talking about the fact that there was no clean water, which means that only very rich people could afford what was called rose water. There was clean water so clean that you could drink it. For anyone else, being thirsty meant that you had to find either milk or you had to drink alcohol. So beer, thin beer. So that means diluted beer. So that means when you look at early modernity, we are looking at a world of people under the influence of alcohol all the time. Then, of course, people had a completely different relationship to time. There were no work times. When people were working in the fields or in shops as craftsmen, they interrupted work all the time to play like children, which meant to dance or to throw a ball, or to do some horseplay, to hit each other in the face and stuff like that. So if we could travel back in time, we would have found people incredibly childish. Because it has been often said that childhood is a modern invention, which is true, but that doesn't mean that children were little adults. It means the opposite. It means that from our point of view, adults would have behaved a lot like children. And of course, then another important thing is anyone we would look at as time travelers, the food was not very nourishing. It wasn't healthy, it wasn't nourishing. So that means only a small amount of rich people were actually fat. Being fat meant that you could afford to eat a lot. Everyone else was undernourished. Was quite. Also, people must have been very tired because all the time, because the food just didn't carry a lot of nutrients, and then of course everyone must have been in pain, or nearly everyone, all the time, because when you broke a bone, it didn't ever heal properly. There was no way to put your leg or arm in a cast or to make it heal. Also, sores didn't heal. People did eat less, did have no sugar, so I think their teeth stayed on longer. But of course, eventually you would have lost them, and most people just didn't have teeth once they reached the age of 30. So these are just a few examples. So to talk about the very concrete aspects of living in your body, in the world, in everyday life, it was a really different experience. And the challenge for me was to imagine what was that like. Because of course, it wasn't some kind of horror show. It wasn't like watching a horror movie for people back then. Not at all. It was just their normal everyday life. It was the life they had, and it felt completely normal to them, the same way our life feels normal to us. And of course, that's also something I had to take into account as a novelist, as a narrator, to not turn this into some kind of horror movie, but to talk about it in a way that makes you feel that just normal, everyday life was very different.
And it was a world of magic, of myth, of superstition,
Yeah.
of dragons,
Yeah.
witches.
Yeah.
They were real.
They were real to everyone. So there was, before Enlightenment, you didn't really have the option to choose between being a reasonable person or being superstitious, because why would you not believe, why would you think magnetism is real, which it is, but dragons and witches are not? So with the information available to you back then, of course you would have believed in curses and witches, and everyone did. And the interesting thing is that people believed in all those things more in early modernity than they did in the so-called Dark Middle Ages. Because in the Dark Middle Ages, people had a very, very firm trust in the church and in God. And in early modernity, they kind of lost that. Also because there were all those different Christian confessions. So suddenly it wasn't that clear anymore that God would be there for you or that your soul would be saved. It was just, all had become very, very confusing. And so the interesting thing is, and one of the important things to learn from all that is, when you really believe in magic and in ghosts and demons and witches and dragons and all that, the Romantics later, who were really deeply influenced by Enlightenment and formed by Enlightenment without wanting to, the Romantic poets thought that was a beautiful world to live in. That world full of magic was really a beautiful thing, and we lost something very profound and poetic. But the truth is, it was a world full of fear. Fear was everywhere. People were afraid of hell. They were so afraid of each other because they believed in curses. Believing in curses is the same thing as living in a dictatorship where anyone can get anyone in prison by just calling the police and saying he denounced Stalin. So anyone can harm anyone all the time. So in one of the big books about everyday life of Northern Europeans I consulted, the whole chapter on how the inward life of people was and what it must have looked like was called fear. And I think that's a valid assessment. So an important thing lesson to draw from that is Enlightenment told us, yes, you are mortal. God might not save you, but still it took away so much fear from us.
The world you're describing, seen from the viewpoint of a human being, seems to be not a very happy time. We talk about progress all the time. Do we live in lighter times today, seen from this kind of subjective point of view?
I think we do. Of course, we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking people were really unhappy all the time and waiting for finally Enlightenment to free them. It was the only life they had, and human beings have a great capacity for, not just for sadness, but also for happiness. So people were well adapted. We always adapt well to anything, but then also it was a really, really difficult time. And I think we are much happier now. Especially, I mean, you don't have to go into a lot of philosophy to establish that. You just have to think of the fact that we are not in pain all the time. I mean, some of us are, but it is possible now to live a life that for long stretches of time is actually free of pain. That is quite new. That is a new thing. And compared to that, anything else you might think of pales in comparison. I mean, the single worst fact of human life, in my opinion, is not the fact that we are mortals, but the fact that we suffer from pain a lot. Pain is really what makes everything worthless. And not death, as Thomas Bernhard said, death makes everything ridiculous. I don't think so, but pain does. And just the simple fact that now we can live without pain means that life is infinitely more happier for most people.
Looking at Tyll, already in the first chapter we get to know that he's a very special person, because he's the contrast to Martha.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about whether or not she should come with them, and then she kind of states, well, I understand that we, the normal beings, will never be like Tyll.
Yes.
What makes him a special person?
Well, first, of course, that he can do a lot of things that the others cannot do. He is an incredible artist on the tightrope. He's very good at juggling. He can imitate people and things like that. So it's in more vulgar times, he would not be able to succeed as an artist, as a musician or a painter, coming from a very humble background as he does. But I imagined him as a kind of equivalent to Shakespeare in a way. So Shakespeare also has a cameo in the book, and Shakespeare was very important to me while writing the book as a kind of a continuous presence and echo point of echoes and references. And I somehow imagine Tyll as kind of a Shakespeare on a tightrope. So just with these more physical, more simple things, he can do things that seem impossible, and the same way Shakespeare can do things that seem impossible with language. Well, so he's a really great artist with very down to earth arts, the things you can do on a village square, and then also, I mean, I turned him into a jester, into a performer actually. In the old anecdotes, he isn't a performer, he's just a prankster. He's just someone who plays evil pranks and then disappears. And the thing that's so fascinating about him as a mythical figure is that you never know why he's playing those pranks. It's just his personality. So the psychological explanation for that is that in early modernity, the onset of what Norbert Elias calls the process of civilization. People learn to behave in civil society. People learn to eat not with their fingers, not to spit all the time, things like that. To go to separate, destined places if they have to defecate and not do it in front of the house. People had to learn all that. And Tyll Ulenspiegel is the person who doesn't accept that process of civilization. So there's something really dangerous and something vulgarly funny about that, because you never know what he's going to do. But what I also discovered and what I found fascinating is the other thing that forms his character. Because if someone is a prankster who keeps playing evil pranks on people, and just on the pure strength of the fact that there will be another prank and another prank, he always has to escape, because people were nice. People would have killed you if you play a prank on them. They wouldn't have called the police. They would have just killed you. So it turns him into an escape artist. Just the fact that there's always another prank. And so what I was fascinated by is that another thing he stands for is the absolute resilience of the artist. He's not a humanist. He's actually thriving in dark times, but they cannot kill him. He will always escape. And he's kind of unmoved and unbowed by the darkness. He's a master of just getting away with his life. And that's what I found very exhilarating to write about that he will always escape.
And at the same time, he speaks the truth in the face of the powerful and gets away with it.
He gets away with it because, strangely, that was the job of the court jester. So the court jester was the person who was allowed to speak truth to power, to speak truth to the princes, and kings, and also to tell them that they were idiots. But of course, it wasn't a protected job. So people have asked me now often, so do you see the artist as a court jester? And I hope not, because that was a world that didn't have freedom of expression, not on any level. So in a way, the court jester had more freedom of expression than even some noblemen had, but there was no safety net attached to it. If he had to be funny, he had to be entertaining, and if he got too far, if the freedom of expression insulted the prince too much, he could just kill him. Anyone could kill him. He was the vagrants were not protected by any law or by anyone. So that's not the freedom you want as an artist. The freedom that you have to be entertaining, otherwise you get killed. So I wouldn't want to identify with that, but it's certainly fascinating. It certainly heightens the pressure to be entertaining. So it definitely something that helps creating, well, maybe not creating good art, but helps being funny. But I wouldn't want that.
Even though the book is called Tyll, you could argue that the main character of the book is the times or the war going on, the 30 Years' War. Why is the war, the 30 Years' War, an interesting setting for the book?
Well, I hope it is an interesting setting, but it's always storytelling and telling, just thinking up a narrative is always more interesting when there's stuff going on. Of course, there are great books just about a man or a woman walking through a city and thinking, but there's also really something to be said for having a story where stuff happens. And of course, since the beginning of literature, people have told stories about wars. I mean, the first examples of literature we have are actually about wars and about how people fighting in wars and people dying in wars or people surviving. That's what we're really interested in. And the 30 Years' War is really, it's a war that's different than many other wars. Some people aren't really aware of the extent of it all. There were more people killed in Germany than, there was a higher, of course not in absolute numbers, but there was a higher percentage of the population killed in Germany than in the First and Second World War. There were, in parts of Bavaria, more than half of the population died. So it was a war of such a devastating extent, of such an unthinkable breakdown of any kind of civil order, that I think in many ways, even subconsciously, Central and Europe and Northern Europe is still shaped by that. Somehow it's still there if there is such a thing as collective memory, it's still there.
And it's a turning point in a way, because
yes,
as you said, that the times of Tyll were the beginning of a civilization process. The 30 Years' War, you could argue, is the beginning of kind of the state structure of Europe.
Yes.
Because when you read your book and when you know a little bit about the 30 Years' War, it's not state interest, but more family interests.
Yes.
And it's everybody against everybody, because it's so funny that we call it a religious war, but Catholics were fighting Catholics. So it's not along the line of confession. No,
it's more, of course, confessions did play an important part. That's what makes it so confusing. But at the same time, it was also really a war between of course, there were the great European noble and royal families, but you could also just call them a couple of warlords fighting for dominance. And politics back then meant family politics. No one even had the idea of trying to devise a policy that would be good for the country or for farmers in general or for any particular part of the population. You did, or the population on the whole. Politics meant family politics, as of course the mafia still thinks like that, and so does Donald Trump, but the rest of the world has moved on from that. But back then that's what it was like. And then on the other hand, towards the end of the war, the modern state structures slowly came into being. So one of the enduring masterpieces of European culture is the Peace of Westphalia, which I'm also have a whole chapter set in Westphalia during the peace negotiations, because there was no system in place to even negotiate. So they had to invent diplomacy in a way to be able to end that war. And they did. But it took a long time. So the first year of negotiations, they couldn't negotiate about how to end the war. They had to negotiate who of the ambassadors was even allowed to talk to whom, and who had to greet each other first, who had to lift his head first, and who was allowed to keep his head on. Stuff like that was very important, which seems kind of ridiculous to the extent of being funny, but it was also very serious, because while they were doing this, people were still dying, but they had to find a way to even talk to each other, because at first they were not allowed to even talk to each other because they were enemies. The idea that that a war was going on but ambassadors could meet had to be devised. It was a new thing. And then they came to some radical conclusions. So even from today's perspective, quite radical. So one of the things they decided was a complete amnesty of all war crimes. So that's the reason why it's kind of doubtful whether the Peace of Westphalia can really be of some guidance if you look for solutions to today's conflicts. Because would we want that? I'm not sure. Would we, if we could end the conflict in Syria by just declaring a total amnesty, whatever happened, it's forgiven on all sides. There will be no criminal prosecution of anyone. It would actually be a lot against, it would really not go very well with our idea of how justice works and how justice should work. So in a way, they were more radical in their urge to create peace than we are today. It's really fascinating. If you look at those 5 years of negotiations, and they never all of them met in a room. It was always bilateral. There were always two ambassadors talking to each other among all those different states. And most of them were not allowed to talk to each other directly, but there was an intermediary to go in between. So it's kind of a miracle that they were able to end the war, but they felt like they had to do it, and they did. And then not just the war was over, but also European diplomacy had been created.
There's a very famous book by Barbara Tuchman, or Tuchman in English, which in German is called Der ferne Spiegel, I think in English The Faraway Mirror. Which
the distant mirror.
The distant mirror, which portrays the Middle Ages as kind of the mirror of the time. I don't want to stretch the parallel into novels and literature, but the thing is, when we read a book today that goes on in the 30 Years' War, we can relate to it. It's about life, it's about human beings. So if we read Tyll in our times and look into the mirror, what do you think we can recognize?
Well, there's one thing in terms of the bigger social picture we can recognize, which is that all that confusion was brought about by new media. By the new media of the printing press, and the incredible amount of propaganda, full of lies, that was created from on all sides, on all political sides, on all confessions, and somehow we have convinced ourselves that that's something new today. We like to use that term fake news. Both sides of the debate use it. But when you use the term propaganda, you become aware of the fact that it's actually quite old. But the amount of propaganda and confusion created by the new printing press was staggering. And I think there's something to be learned in terms of on social terms. It means that when there's a new medium, there is always a period of confusion, anger, and aggression fueled by that new medium before we learn how to deal with it, before structures of authority establish themselves, and before, well, back then people had to learn how to understand whether a book was a serious book or some propaganda leaflet printed by some hack or some veteran liar. And the same way today we have to learn how to distinguish a news item on Facebook, how to distinguish whether it's from the Washington Post or whether it's some kind of Russian propaganda meant to influence elections somewhere. And we will do that. The structures of authority and structures to understand these things will establish themselves. The only thing is, usually back then when it happened, there was a lot of violence. It caused a gigantic war, and we cannot afford that anymore. So that's something on bigger social terms to learn. And yeah, I think that's an important thing I can think of.
Maybe another parallel is that we still operate and think in groups, majorities, minorities, in and outs, foreigners against citizens. Is that a human constant that we think like this?
I'm afraid it is. I'm afraid it is a human constant. I mean, there have been some very instructive social experiments about how fast people, if you can just invite random people to some kind of random gathering, and just by giving them random red and blue chips and telling them you're the red group, you're the blue group, and then you have some kind of game where people can decide whether everyone here will get a small amount of money, or just their group will get it. So they have to decide whether everyone will be happy or their group will be a little bit more happy than the other group. But their group doesn't mean anything, because that group was just formed like 10 minutes ago. They don't know these people. And most people will then decide in favor of their group. It's very sad, and it's certainly something to be aware of, that there is always this trap in our mind of forming groups and feeling like we are part of one group, and that group defines who we are. And it usually doesn't. I mean, in some cases it does, but quite often it doesn't. It's just an inherent hidden trap in our mind. And of course, when this thinking in groups turns into utter catastrophe, then you have something like the 30 Years' War, like any religious war, or you have people today reacting towards refugees coming into their country with incredible coldness of the heart, in a way, because fears, and also rejection, in the way that, of course, I would help people, but for people to be, for me to be able or to be willing to help them, they have to be my group. If they're not from my group, then my pity and my empathy doesn't extend to them. And the big lesson of being human, of course, is to learn that your empathy should extend to every suffering human being, and also to suffering animals, by the way. So any being who can suffer is a being worthy of your empathy. And yeah, that's always a lesson every one of us has to learn every day, or to relearn and to keep working on ourselves to to better realize that. But yeah, when I look at today's what they call refugee crisis, I don't see that much of a crisis. It's kind of a made-up crisis. But the thing I'm most appalled by is not the fact that people will say, wait a moment, we have to think about whom we can let into the country, whom we cannot give asylum, things like that. But it's the coldness of heart with which people, also in politics, especially in politics, often react to that. And the lack of empathy towards people who are clearly suffering and who need our help. And Europe, not a long time ago, was flooded with refugees. And I don't mean the 30 Years' War. Of course, I mean the Second World War, of course. And then, of course, earlier there was the 30 Years' War, which was also so. It's not something that only happens far away in distant part of the world where people cannot get their lives in order. It actually happened just here in Europe a very, very short time ago. And so that also puts us under moral obligation to help.